Wow, what a country, huh? I mean, where else could a guy like me share the stage with such fine people and look out over such a good-looking crowd of people? And where else could people like us gather and criticize our government and speak up and not worry about tear gas or jail or bullets? Only in America, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to have been asked today to speak on the Constitution. And I have 5 questions about the Constitution that I want to answer for you. And I'll try to do it briefly, though. You know, it's hard for a lawyer to do anything briefly. What is it? What is the Constitution? What's its purpose? How did we get it? How does it work? And how is it threatened? Well, what is the Constitution, folks? The Constitution is what's called a social contract. It's an agreement between the government and the governed, between the government and the people. And it can't be changed without the consent of the people. And what is the purpose of the Constitution? I tell you, the Constitution has one purpose, and one purpose only, and that is to protect our freedom. How did we get a Constitution? Well, George Washington, our founding father, the father of our country, and the president of the Constitutional Convention had this to say about how we got our Constitution. He said the adoption of the Constitution was demonstrated, and I quote, as a visibly the finger of providence, that's God, as any possible event in the course of human affairs. In short, he, like many of our founding fathers, felt that it was inspired by God. To understand why, we have to put our history in perspective. And we have to look at what was going on in Europe when the founding fathers formed our country and listen carefully. Because if we let our freedom slip by now, this is our future. At the time of the founding of our country, Europe, from whence our founders came, was a collection of totalitarian states ruled by kings and queens. By and large, the average citizen, people like us, had no rights. Only privileges that were granted by the crown and could be revoked by the whim of the monarch at any time. The average European at the time paid taxes to a state-ordained church. They had no say where they worshiped, or if they worshiped, or how they worshiped. In fact, if they chose to worship somehow different, they were subject to confiscation of their property, imprisonment, and sometimes even execution. Most Europeans would never, ever own land. That was a privilege granted by the crown only to the aristocracy, the rich. And it was taxed so heavily that it was beyond the reach of the average man. To speak against the king was a crime. It was called sedition. It was punishable by death or imprisonment. There was no freedom to stand and speak out like we hear today. There was no freedom to write a letter to the editor or to write an article. Anything that would reflect badly on the crown or the government. The ownership of arms, the means of revolt, was restrained for the privileged class only. Violating that law in most countries in Europe meant sure death. You see, the means of revolt at all costs must be kept from the masses, because tyrants have always known that an armed man is a citizen and an unarmed man is a subject. In most of Europe, there were 2 classes of people. There was the aristocracy, the rich. You had to be born in that class. And there were the peasants, the poor, and that was everybody else. There was a small middle class, heavily taxed, so heavily taxed that it could never be a threat to the aristocracy's social position or wealth. It was very popular at the time of the founding of our country for the enlightened monarch to claim that he was taking from the haves to give to the have-nots so that all might be equal. This generally, however, meant taking from the little middle class, taking a bite out of it along the way, and then giving it to the poor. Sound familiar? People were literally sold into slavery as indentured servants or imprisoned if they couldn't pay their debts. In short, with the exception of England and Switzerland, there was no concept of individual rights. The government was all-powerful in all things in life. And even in England and Switzerland, the rights were limited largely by your economic class. This was the backdrop upon which our Constitution was presented, folks. Never before in recorded human history had a people voluntarily come together in peace and not under any threat and created a framework to protect themselves from their government. That is what our Constitution is. The idea that individuals had rights was indeed revolutionary in and of itself. Let me quote to you from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And the Declaration went on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This, then, was the core principle of the founder, that all people have rights, that rights come from God, not from government, and that it is the government's job to protect those rights. Now, these newly proclaimed rights were not just freely handed over, but rather they were wrested from what was then the world's greatest